So it's a great honor now to introduce our first speaker from the Office of the Secretary of Defense, the Honorable Robert H. McMahon. He serves as the first ever Assistant Secretary of Defense for Sustainment. Mr. McMahon previously served as the Assistant Secretary for Logistics and Material Readiness from November of 2017 to August of 2018. As the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Sustainment, he is principal logistics official within the department, for which about 170 billion per year is spent in logistics operations in the military. Mr. McMahon also oversees the department's real estate of over 500 installations and 28 million acres valued over $1 trillion. In that portfolio, he manages the military construction, environmental, energy, and occupational safety. It's a big, daunting job. But he has the right background in industry and in the military. As a major general in the Air Force, he served for 34 years. He has a background in maintenance, logistics, installations, well qualified for the job. In industry, he was president of a large real estate firm, as well as he worked with Boeing. His last position in the Air Force was as commander Warner Robins Logistics Center, one of the 3 Air Force logistics centers providing global support to multiple weapon systems. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Honorable Bob McMahon.
I'm looking to see if my mother's here. She's the only one that cares about all of that. Well, good morning. Try it again. Well, good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you very much. A tremendous crowd here today. This is fantastic. Andy, thank you very much. This does not happen, and many of you have had the opportunity, especially those in the front row, of doing something like this, putting it together, and it happens because we've got a great team of folks, but great teams need great leaders. Andy, how about you and your team that put this together? Please stand up for a round of applause. $1,600 cats all going in the direction they want to go, and 4 people are trying to herd them in a common direction. An absolutely phenomenal job. So to you, thank you very much. While I'm doing it, John, thank you very much for your leadership. You're a tremendously busy person in and around every day, and to be able to dedicate the time that you are doing here, thank you very much for that leadership. It is tremendously important. And you think about this over 75 years to get to where we are today, the things that have happened. I can picture in my mind a couple of truck drivers and a couple of C-47 pilots getting together talking about the good old days, and suddenly we've come to where we are today, and I think that's tremendous, and it ought to be a reflection of the folks in this room for the fact that we continue to grow each and every day. We've mentioned a couple of times that General Lyons is not here today. General Lyons is actually right now at Camp David. And he is there with the Secretary of Defense, the other combatant commanders, the undersecretaries of the Department of Defense, and the service secretaries, talking about what we as a nation need to be doing to protect and preserve this nation as it exists today. Having looked at what the slides are going to talk about and where the focus of this effort will be, it applies directly to our topic and our focus this year at NDTA. It is my expectation that the 2 topics that will be discussed the most over the next 8 or 10 hours at Camp David will first of all be command and control, and secondly will be logistics in a contested environment against a great power in competition. The question is, in that environment, in that discussion, who is responsible, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, for globally setting and sustaining the world with logistics? If the chairman is the global integrator, who sets that globe logistically? And who sustains that globe logistically? And how does that happen in the environment that we're about to go into, perhaps in great power competition in the next conflict that we face? Many of those answers are in this room today. If you are a program manager in private sector, 10 years from now, you could be the CEO responsible for helping develop that solution. If you're a field grade officer, you're going to be one of the flag officers in the future that will be executing in that environment. And if you're a young company grade officer, you'll be one of those commanders responsible for achieving that which you'll be asked to do and leading men and women to protect this nation and preserve it as it exists. And so the challenge will be, how do you think differently? How do you behave differently? If I could have my first slide, please. Really thinking about the future. And the title today, or for this year, when we talk about preserving peace, we can only preserve peace if the enemy knows that we will prevail in war. And so the question is, how do we prove that to the level that we need to? So I asked Andy when he asked me to come here what he wanted me to talk about. He said about 20 minutes. And then to leave about 20 minutes for questions, so that will be the intent. So if you're thinking of questions, this would be a great time to be thinking about that, and we'll look and see how this process goes. But the real challenge is thinking about the future. And today is less about talking to you than it is to challenge you to help us to think differently. And it begins by, no kidding, thinking differently. Slide, please. We have, for 1,000 years in the Department of Defense, and I was there 1,000 years ago, spent our entire life talking about inputs. And so we would consider all of the inputs to all the different conversations that we would have, and we would talk about adding those inputs together, and it drives us to a single solution. Our challenge together is to think about what it is that we want to do, and then let our imagination run wild about how we might achieve it. For many of the young officers, NCOs, and commercial program managers, you have a boss somewhere above you. When you come up with this really cool, innovative idea, they pat you on the head, thank you for that, and send you back to the corner. Because over time, those leaders have been biased by their experiences and won't necessarily allow us to think differently. What we've done for the last 2 decades and proven very effectively in Southwest Asia is irrelevant in this atmosphere of great power competition. As we normally do, sitting around last night telling war stories, talking about being in Southwest Asia in 2010 during the Kyrgyzstan coup, where we were flying everyone into Afghanistan through Manas and running our tanker operations out of Manas. A coup takes place in Kyrgyzstan. In a matter of about 4 or 5 days, we simply swing the effort to move through Kuwait, because we were with an enemy that we had unfettered access to those transportation modes that we needed to. When the PAC-G lock closed down, we simply began flying stuff in. The environment that we face in the future will not allow us to do that. And so we need together to find new solutions, new ideas, and it begins with defining what it is we're trying to achieve and working backwards from there. If your expectation is that I'm going to come up with that, you are going to be sorely disappointed. As I look at the front row of senior leaders, they likely are not going to come up with it. But if I look in the back half of this room, with innovative, imaginative folks, it is your job to help us think differently, because today's environment demands that. Slide, please. Any discussion we have in the Department of Defense begins with the National Defense Strategy. Our new secretary, in his first words at the department, with the president sitting there, talked about those 3 lines of effort. He added a 4th, and that's taking care of our people. But it's about building a more lethal force, lethality and readiness. It's about the partnering that we do, and I will take that word partnering and expand it beyond just our national partners and our international partners. But what is truly important in this room is creating that relationship between the public and private sector. How do we do business differently? How do we create that relationship to be able to achieve those things that we need to go do? And then finally, this concept of reformation, changing not only to be more efficient, but for this audience, how do we become more effective? We have a tendency within Washington to look at everything with dollar signs. By the way, it is great to be out of Washington. Words cannot describe how good it is to be out of Washington right now. It is. You think you've been to Disneyland, Disney World, the circus? Welcome to my world. But when we talk about reform and we talk about dollars, the reality is, how do we, with the resources we have, become a heck of a lot more effective at the mission that we're doing than we are today? Because the reality is, the budget that we have today is probably the best we're going to see in your lifetime and mine. And so, as that comes down, that challenge will be there. And oh, by the way, it isn't quite as easy as it was, and I use the word easy in relative terms, when we were focused simply on violent extremists. China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, in addition to those violent extremists, which are all constant threats, as you all know, by simply looking at the news and reading the paper each and every day. We have, as you should know, focused and beginning to focus more and more on China. The threat it provides to our nation is real. We are at war with them today in multiple arenas, whether it is cyber, whether it is in the gray zone. But that conflict exists today, and what we've got to be able to do is ensure not only can we effectively fight that conflict today, but in the future as well. A lot of energy focused. Unfortunately, our nation is focused in other areas, and so America writ large does not understand, I think, the threat that China presents to our nation, what they're doing each and every day in all elements of conflict, not only militarily, but economically as well. Their influence growing around the world. And so part of our responsibility, when that is not clear, is to be able to still take the actions that we need to take. Slide, please. The environment of fighting in the South Pacific is a tremendous challenge for our nation as we look at not only the challenges of facing the first island chain, the second island chain, the third island chain, but as we've begun to discuss, the fourth and fifth island chain in the Indian Ocean. This is especially a daunting task for the people in this room, because we have got to set the theater, and then we have to sustain the theater in ways that we have not even begun to think about. How do you get fuel to where you need to be? How do you take a new concept of operations that the Navy's talking about, or that the Air Force is talking about, in this enhanced agility and the ability to sustain that? How do you get fuel to an F-35 when you don't know where that F-35 is going to be 4 hours from now? How do you rearm it, repair it, and relaunch it? How do you build the capacity to go do that? Where are you launching that capacity from? And how do you protect that in the environment that we're talking about, when the capacity of our enemy can reach as far as they can? Slide, please. Doesn't get much easier in Europe. When we look at the rail system, when we look at the infrastructure, I was in Poland just recently. Went to where the Army was going to put its APS. To get there was on a dirt road, crossing little wooden bridges. And I'm going to take an entire brigade's worth of equipment there. I will, up until the first tank goes across that bridge and it collapses, then it's going to slow down a whole lot. That's not somebody's problem, it's our problem in this room of how we go do that. And then how do we move forward from there? That's assuming we can get into a port. And what do those ports look like? Slide, please. But the bad news is, it isn't just a threat in the Europe or in the Indo-PACOM theater, it's right here at home. Whether it is our physical infrastructure with bridges and rails, or whether it is the electrical grid, we are under attack today, and we have the ability to have it impacted today, and it impacts the folks in this room. The ability to shut down ports, the ability to affect our rail system, cyber attacks on mom and pop shipping companies who we rely on each and every day. How do we do and deal with that differently tomorrow than we are today? Slide, please. And so we look at this individually, or we look at this collectively. The need for thinking differently. Thinking differently is here today. And so as we gather together for the 75th anniversary of NDTA, at no time in our history has what we do been more important in this room than where we are today, because of the threats that we face. Slide, please. So some questions for you. What are those correct assets? What does a truck of the future look like? What does the ship of the future look like? What am I delivering fuel on and in? As I thought about this morning, I was reminded when I was a child of Dick Tracy. How many have heard of Dick Tracy? All right. Dick Tracy had this really cool thing on his wrist. I mean, it was all imaginary, it could never happen. But it had a little television screen, and he could communicate and talk into it and see a picture on the other end. That's the most absurd thing you ever saw, except we can do it today. What's the transportation concept that we are drawing up today that's just as absurd that 10 years from now, one of you will dream of to be able to create, to be able to make happen, to give us what we need in this kind of environment? And how do the leaders up front create the environment to encourage you to think about what that might be? What are those threats to us when we talk about resilience? Cyber, weather, water, climate. What's resilience with our partners? Do we have the ability to do that? And as we look, not knowing where that next threat is going to be or where it's going to come from, have we properly set the globe? And then do we have the ability to very agilely, effectively, and quickly reset the globe for having guessed wrong of where that threat may come from? It's tremendously easy to sit up on this or stand up on this stage and give you all these questions. The real challenge is for you outside of this room to be able to think about these questions, to ponder these questions, to debate these questions, and begin in your mind and that with your partners between military services, between the military and the private sector, between modes of transportation, to talk about what the solutions might look like as we get ready for the threat that may be here sooner than we think, or perhaps if we don't act, sooner than we're prepared for. The reality is we live in a nation that has in its entire history been imaginative and innovative, rewarding those that came up with great ideas, encouraging that to take place. And so the future, I think, is positive. It should be exciting. But if we remain complacent, we'll in the end be fraught with challenges that will be exceedingly hard to overcome. Very simply, if we go back to what our focus is this week at this conference, focused on ensuring that we can ensure peace will prevail only by ensuring that our potential enemies will truly understand the consequences if they challenge our peace. Slide, please. As we look at this, some terms to think about: cyber, agility, modernization. Agility being the most important as we look to the future through the threats both in the Pacific and Europe as well as here at home. Slide, please. Attributable to Einstein may or may not have been true. Definition of insanity: expecting different results from the same actions. We have a history of innovation with shiny objects. In Civil War, the Gatling gun fundamentally changed the way that we fought. the aircraft carrier, the airplane, unmanned aerial vehicles. Fundamental changes in the way that we accomplished our mission. The question is, in the business that we're in, what are those game-changing concepts and technologies to allow us not only to reach parity, but to get back to where we need to be in terms of leadership in this world of transportation, logistics, and sustainment? The answer isn't up here. The answer's out there. And I challenge you to think about it and to provide those ideas to our senior leaders to make sure they're thinking about it in a way that perhaps they haven't. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to be here today. Thank you for what you do each and every day, whether military or civilian, whether public or private. Thanking you for helping continue to make this the world's greatest nation. God bless you. May God continue to bless this nation. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have about 10, 15 minutes for questions for Mr. McMahon. So I'd offer to use the app or come to the microphone, either way. And we've got a lot of experience here at a very senior level, so I'm sure there's questions out there for Mr. McMahon. And but the app is a good way to get these questions in. So, but otherwise, please feel free. And I think we do have somebody at the mic.
Just making sure this is on. Good morning, sir. Thank you for coming. My name is Captain Joanna Heigl with the U.S. Coast Guard stationed at Transcom. My question is, how does the internal political conflict of our nation affect our ability to address the global threats that you mentioned in your presentation?
Great question. Who's got the next question? Andy, you promised me softballs. Obviously, not everyone got that word.
You've got nothing to lose, sir.
I'm going to answer the question kind of tangentially, and then I'll get to it. Multiple times a year, I have the opportunity to go testify before Congress. And every time I go testify before Congress, I take a beating. It doesn't matter the subject. It could be privatized military housing. It could be PFAS, PFOA. It could be climate change. It could be the border wall, of which I have a responsibility for. You know, it's great to be me. But every time I go in, it's a public beating, and it doesn't matter which of those topics. Let me switch to a private environment where I go in and sit down, perhaps with 2 or 3 members of Congress, 2 or 3 senators, and I have a meaningful dialogue. And I go and describe that to you, not for you to feel sorry for me. I'm here because I want to be, but to let you know that there's a difference between a public and a private focus. And what we see, because we've got lots of people wanting to make news, tell stories, do whatever it is they want to do, in that 15 minutes of fame, and you got people trying to sell TV and newspapers, is one perspective. I will tell you that nearly every member of Congress, the members of the administration, are rational human beings who believe in our nation. And so if we take it off the public stage, meaningful dialogue takes place. I read a story this morning, or saw a story this morning, and I'll finish here to answer your question. And it was a story about Ellen DeGeneres and George Bush, who are about the extremes of political belief in our nation. They went to a Dallas Cowboys football game last Sunday together. And the point of the story was to say, and this is quoting Ms. DeGeneres, that what America is about is dialogue. And if you are on different ends of the spectrum, there's no reason we can't still have rational dialogue. And I think that exists. I watch the theater each and every day. Periodically, I have an opportunity to be part of that theater. But I think if we all collectively look past that, think about what it is that we need to go do, we can go make that happen. And we're doing that each and every day, irrespective of where your political belief is in the structure. Thank you for the question. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Honorable McMahon. Appreciate your insights, and particularly the insights for where we need to go into the future. As you know, United States Transportation Command is fielding right now a prototype transportation management system, the TMS. And by the way, there's a session tomorrow at 3:30 on the TMS. I would like to get your views.
This is a paid political statement.
I didn't mention.
Just in case anybody missed that.
I didn't mention my name was Pete Gavornik, and I work for, I'm on the core team for the TMS. But I'm very interested in your views as to the potential of that TMS for achieving those future where we need to be results with respect to agility and cyber security and all of the things that you mentioned, business reform and all of that. What is your anticipation for the ability, the necessity for that? Thank you.
Great question. From my perspective, there's two ways that we can do business. The first is we can be vertically oriented by service. And if you go back and read Title 10, it talks about organized, train, equip, service responsibility. Or, despite that fact, we can be horizontally integrated. TMS gives us the ability to horizontally integrate, to be able to look across the entire spectrum of the transportation management structure and business area, to be able to hook together with single capability, not a single system necessarily, but a single capability to fully integrate in an environment where it will be absolutely necessary. And so the prototyping that we're doing now, and I think prototyping runs through January or February of 2020, we're demonstrating some concepts. Is it working? The answer is absolutely. Are there some things we're identifying? The answer is absolutely we should be. But what it is underscoring is that we have the ability, instead of looking vertically, of being able to connect horizontally across the enterprise to create effects that otherwise we would not create. It also helps us in something that's very important to our Congress and to our department today in terms of auditability. And that's an integral part of our business today, whether we like it or not. And so we have the ability to understand holistically much better than we have in the past as we create this capability. Is there going to be a 1.0, a 2.0, a 3.0? The answer is yes. But as long as we continue headed in this direction, looking horizontally across the enterprise, I think we'll be in great shape. We'll continue to evolve it. And I think it's worth the energy that we're putting in today to demonstrate what the art of the possible is. So I'm excited about it. I think it will continue to be very important to us as we continue to evolve it. Yes, sir.
Yeah, good morning, sir. My name is Major Curtis Gibbs from the United States Army Europe G4. And my question is this: China's Belt and Road Initiative is putting Chinese actors in places that people in this room operate in every single day. Could you maybe shed some light on what the government is doing to counteract that?
Our government?
Yes, sir.
I think part of this is there's a variety of different things from my perspective of what we're trying to do. One is first of all, an understanding of what the threat is. And we start with an economic threat and understand, and you've seen a lot of that play out in the public of recent. One of General Lyons' favorite charts, though, and one of mine as well, is a look at where China is active in terms of either ownership or management of a seaport or of an airport. And you begin to look across the nation of what that impact is. And places very near or concurrent with where we physically are, to your point. Djibouti happens to come to mind as a location where that occurs. The question becomes, how do we deal with that? And I think part of what we're trying to understand are what are our options? How do we influence that on our own? How do we, as a nation, deal with that? Do we simply roll and move away? Is there economic things that we can do? If they're already in place, what's the impact of that? How do we preclude additional expansion? Where is it that we need to go? I think part of this is, and you should have seen a story probably last week about the department standing up an office focused specifically on China. Those become part of the questions of how most effectively do we deal with that. And I think that's part of what you'll see. There are a lot of folks out in this audience who've been doing this for a long time, who happen to be part of some think tanks. They're helping us understand what those options are. But I don't know that there is a clear silver bullet of how to go deal with that. It's first acknowledgement. The first thing we have to do is acknowledge we have a problem, what the potential impact of that is, and then understanding what those options may be. And I think we're in that process today. It's a very unsatisfying answer to you, but I think that's the reality of where we are today, is coming to grips with that. And oh, by the way, as we have that conversation, we'll get a similar conversation about Russia as well, and understand holistically what that means and how do you go deal with it. Though China, again, is the first among equals when we talk about those threats. Thanks. All the questions were on that side.
Well, I think maybe with the application probably has some questions.
Got one down here.
Yes, Mr. Secretary, this came in from the NDTA app. You mentioned that the future requires a different way of thinking. How do you break through the logjam of many leaders, some leaders, and particularly mid-level leaders who are resistant to change?
When do the softball questions start? Irrespective of what it is that we do, we had a conversation at breakfast this morning talking about organic industrial base, and the same question came up. How do you deal with the frozen middle? And the challenge is, in many cases, you've got to educate them. In some cases, you've got to encourage them. And in some cases, you've got to remove them. Because there are impediments, no matter where we go or what topic we talk about, that force us to be able to do with a frozen middle who's very comfortable with the status quo, doesn't want it to change. They've only got 4 years, 6 years, 10 years, whatever it is, until they retire, and they don't want anything to muck that up. And so the question is, there are some young, innovative man or woman down below who's got some great ideas that can't get it to the top because of that middle. So again, education, motivation, and then the other option. And termination, that's exactly right. And they get a choice, and as you go through this, the first one that gets terminated has a great impact on both education and motivation. You can deal with it from there.
And Mr. McMahon, can I tell a quick story? One time when I was a Navy captain, my boss said, Captain, you're not doing what I told you to do, so I need to know right now if you're going to do it, or else I'm going to have to find another captain who will. And that was a very freeing moment for me.
Eddie, I'm assuming you
me
saw his way.
Yes, we worked things out.
Clear communications. Great question. Thank you. Anything else for me? Well, again, to all of you, I gave you no answers.
Do we have any more questions?
I do have another question.
We've got a few minutes.
I love plants.
Sir, also from the application. You mentioned that budgets continue to be pressed and the cost of shiny objects ever increasing. Do you see any fundamental reforms in the logistics environment ahead to increase efficiency in processes and systems?
So let me talk about shiny objects. And I mean, I live in an organization called Acquisition and Sustainment. Acquisitions focused on shiny objects. And whether it is the F-35, which consumes about 25% of my time on any given day trying to figure out how we sustain it, whether it is new aircraft carriers, whether it is new submarines, whether it is fill in the blank hypersonics. We are enamored by shiny objects. My football analogy, we're in football season. Those are the quarterbacks, the running backs, and the ends. I'm a sustainment guy, I'm a loggy, I'm a lineman. Nobody cares about me, I'm never on Sports Illustrated. That's just who we are. We're not very exciting, we're not sexy, we're just essential. And so when we talk about sustainment, we have to acknowledge who we are and where we fit in all of this. But we also have to explain to leaders that at the end of the day, no football team ever won a national championship or a Super Bowl that didn't have world-class linemen. And so part of this is being proud of what we are and what we do and who we are, and understanding that unless we innovate and change how we're doing it, we're not going to succeed. And so part of this is just creating, it goes back to the other question, part of this is creating the environment that allows those who have ideas to be able to express them, to be able to talk about them, to bring them up, to have debates in environments such as this. And this is why this NDTA is so important. You will find tonight, no doubt, a grizzly old flag officer talking to a young company-grade officer with a couple of CEOs and a young program manager debating something because after perhaps a sip of an adult beverage, that company-grade officer said, by God, I'm going to go take on that general, and we're going to have this conversation. That's how these conversations take place. And we get past the frozen middle because the flag officer, the general, the admiral, heard the conversation and said, that's the damnedest thing I'd ever heard of. We never thought of that. And then it evolves and goes from there. And so creating that environment allows that to happen. Now, I know that didn't answer the question, but this is creating the opportunity, and that's what this couple of days are about, is creating that opportunity for that communication that gets us to where we need to be.
Okay, do we have any other easy questions, please? I was going to ask you, could you explain what does it mean to have global, set the globe, with globally integrated operations? In your mind, what would be some of the top priorities there?
So as I think everyone's aware, the chairman has been given the responsibility to be the global integrator by the Secretary of the Defense. Somebody has to set the globe logistically for that. And we could talk about fuel. We could talk about APS. We could talk about basic parts. We could talk about provisioning. We could talk about the commodities, all of those different things that are finite capabilities and finite amounts, and then figure out how it is, given that we can't have 100% everything we need, how do we consider where that ought to be physically located? Back as you read through that boring biography of me or whatever it was, you talked about, having been an Air Force logistician. We used to have debates about WRM, war readiness material. Does that belong in Europe or does it belong in the Pacific? The answer is, and there would be some, God bless him, captain or senior NCO that said, that's mine. The answer, it ain't yours. It's the departments, it's not even the Air Forces. But how do I place that, get rid of the ownership and figure out where the largest threat is and go deal with that? Where should my transportation assets be? Where should I, and there's risk with every decision we make. But how do we think about the finite resources? Fuel's the one that keeps me awake at night. How do we sufficiently build the capacity around the world to be able to support all the requirements that we have? Pre-positioning stocks, how do we do that? How best do we do that? How do I leverage our commercial partners differently than I am today to have more stocks available in those locations? That's what globally setting or logistically setting the globe really means to me.
Yeah, I think that piece about not thinking you own it and being able to swing it globally pretty quickly is really important.
And hiding in plain sight, I talk with my commercial friends. If I had a commercial ship that was traversing in the Pacific each and every day. What happens to be on that ship? I don't know. What could be on that ship? Well, it's pretty being imaginative, thinking about it differently. Those are the kind of things to get us ready for this is what we have to be talking about.
Well, Mr. McMahon, we certainly appreciate your time this morning, and NDTA is going to make a small donation to one of the several good organizations that support our veterans in your name.
Thanks, Eddie.
So thank you very much.
Thanks, my friend.
Now, hopefully our panel is here. Do I have a thumbs up? Okay, all right. Now we'll hear from our Cyber Roundtable. It's being led by Mr. Tom Musante. Tom is the Senior Director of IT and Governance at Atlas Air. He's responsible for the planning and administration of the operational business within Atlas Air. He ensures the integrity of IT operational processes, compliance with financial, regulatory, security, and audit requirements. This includes operational metrics, quality improvement, audit management, and security planning. Really appreciate all the effort Tom has put into this fantastic panel, and I'll turn it over to him to introduce his team. Tom?